everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for having me to the front team. Super excited to be with all of you today. Now, before I get going, I need to know, can I trust this audience to be honest with me? Yeah, okay, all right. So let's kind of rewind the clock here a little bit. You're getting ready for front. You're looking through the schedule, looking at speakers, looking at titles of some of the talks, and all of a sudden you come across this 451 days of cross-functional leadership at Pluralsight. Now, raise your hand if when you saw that, you saw one of these hold my fry sauce memes. Come on, that had to have happened to somebody, right? No? All right, you're right. Okay, I've got a couple hands, so at least we know part of the audience is honest here, but super appreciate it. I think today what I invite you to do with me is to actually go back in time, pre-COVID, March 2019, and what I'm going to be talking about are lessons that we learned at Pluralsight from March 2019 to about June 2020, and some of the org design changes that we enacted to really elevate the experience org at Pluralsight to the next level. And I really hope that, along the way, what we're going to talk about will be valuable to you in helping you create a bigger and a better impact for your customers. I hope that it's going to help you along the course of my talk get a better understanding of what you can do to help teams create healthy tension rather than live in conflict. And that ultimately, you'll see that even though a high performance or a high performing org design is super valuable, and I'm a big fan, I'm going to talk a lot about what we did, that really at the end of the day, a lot of this is going to come back to you as individuals and about how you show up on the teams that you play a part of. So before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge and publicly thank Nate Walkinshaw, who was the Chief Experience Officer at Pluralsight for all of this, who really had the vision and ability to execute the changes we're talking about, and the rest of his leadership team that I was able to be a part of. These are really phenomenal leaders. I learned a lot from them and with them, and a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today comes from the experiences I had with them. So if you bump into any of these people, give them a big thanks for anything that was good here on the talk today. So jumping back into March 2019, let's talk about some of the things that were happening at Pluralsight. The IPO that we had was an almost distant memory. It had been almost 2 years since we had gone through that event. We had about 40 product experience teams, and we were in the thick of a go-to-market pivot as we were continuing transitioning into kind of a top-down enterprise sales motion to complement the more kind of direct-to-consumer, direct-to-an-individual developer experience that we had had for a long time. And we were also about to acquire a company by the name of GitPrime for $170 million that was going to enable Pluralsight to become a true enterprise multi-product platform. So there was a lot going on. We were continuing to grow super fast and had a lot of the challenges coming along with that. And the building block of all of the success at Pluralsight from 2015 when Nate joined and really brought directed discovery with him to Pluralsight has been product experience teams. And at Pluralsight, a product experience team is a product manager, a product designer, and typically 4 to 8 full-stack software engineers. They're responsible for the entire life cycle of the product experience they work on. There's no QA team. They have high accountability and high autonomy for how they're going to enact and deliver customer outcomes. And prior to the changes that I'm about to talk about, how the org design looked for about 4 years at Pluralsight was these product experience teams with the product manager, product designer, and software engineers. The software engineers would report into a manager or director of software engineering, while the product manager and product designers would be reporting into a VP of product. And then ultimately, those leaders reported into heads of various functions, who then reported into our Chief Experience Officer, Nate Walkinshaw. So what this meant is, along the way, we had all of the normal kind of conflict that you would expect to have within a cross-functional team. You'd have disagreement between functions. You may have product managers or product designers who are, worried about some of the things happening on the engineering team. You've got product managers, product designers talking to their VP product, who's then got to go talk to the engineering leader. Somebody's got to come in and kind of break the tie here of what's going on. And in addition to all of the normal conflict that you might anticipate, we also had a couple of other challenges occurring. we ultimately had customer and business needs that weren't fully aligned to our organizational structure of these teams, because as we grew from 1 or 2 product experience teams up to 40, you can kind of imagine how we did that in terms of just adding additional VPs of product, adding additional directors of engineering, and the way in which we organized those groups of teams wasn't fully aligned to some of the challenges that we were experiencing. We were also honestly having a really tough time trying to coordinate across 40+ teams. Quarter after quarter with OKRs, being able to establish key initiatives, being able to manage dependencies across teams, even though we were operating within a bounded context or largely microservices design that created a lot of autonomy between teams, the coordination cost was actually really, really high and becoming super cumbersome. And then the other thing that we were experiencing was the quality of the direct-to-discovery practices that Nate was championing, could honestly be a little hit or miss across some of the teams. And so as we were experiencing these types of conflict, we decided to go ahead as a leadership team and make a change to a couple of key elements. The first, and I'll talk more about this in a moment in terms of what this means, the first is that we organized our teams around Pluralsight's core value streams. So Pluralsight's business model is really founded on being able to have these amazing learning experiences that help individual technologists keep on top of the pace of technology change. And what that means is we have to provide value to an individual, but ultimately sell that value to a company or an organization. And there's a complex network of how all this plays out between the curriculum that we choose to build, the content that we produce, how we provide that value out to individual learners or developers, and then ultimately how all of that rolls up into value for an enterprise organization. So we organized our teams around the core value streams that I'll outline here in a minute. We also created a centralized practices organization that had the mandate of helping ensure that across all of our disciplines, from product management to product design to software engineering to content to curriculum, that we had really amazing expert practitioners that were part of this centralized practices organization to help train, onboard, and provide support to individual contributors. And then the final and perhaps the most important change in many respects was we introduced cross-functional leaders. And so what all of this looked like is going back to those core value streams. The foundation for how Pluralsight created value for its customers was being able to really understand across the entire technology landscape, what are the trends that are happening, what are the technologies that are becoming hot, what are the needs that organizations have, and how do we think about our curriculum in a way to go meet those needs. Once that's understood, Pluralsight then has to produce content and learning experiences that create these really powerful outcomes for Pluralsight learners, technologists. And then again, as I mentioned, being able to wrap all of that up for technology leaders like CTOs or CIOs that provides enterprise value across thousands of technologists within an organization. And so these 4 core value streams really became the foundation of how we thought about our org design. We then had kind of a centralized infrastructure team as well to handle a lot of our architecture and infrastructure to establish reusability and consistency of technology and engineering standards across the teams, and then this practices organization that I had mentioned earlier. So what this looks like is now you take these product experience teams that I've described, product manager, product designer, typically 4 to 8 full stack software engineers, and rather than reporting into a VP of product or a director of software engineering, they would all report into a director of that core value stream. So I was the leader for the tech leader enterprise experiences. So in my case, in my organization, I had several directors of these tech leader product experiences that were responsible holistically for hiring, recruiting, managing, every aspect of leadership for all 3 of the disciplines that composed these product experience teams. And these leaders would then report into these heads of these various experiences, which then would roll up into the broader organization. And as I mentioned, these teams and these leaders were ultimately supported by a principal product manager, a principal product designer, and a principal software engineer that would help ensure that the quality of the work, the quality of the practices, the way in which we were accomplishing the work that we were doing, that we were able to consistently elevate how all of that was happening at the team level within a centralized way that enabled consistency and quality across all of the different teams. And eventually, before I left Pluralsight, we'd hit over 50 product experience teams. And so you can see here as a representation, how 2 of these core value stream organizations would play together. And what this really meant here is that as you have these value streams and as you have all of these different competing interests happening, the really the tension between the various value streams is where Nate was most interested in being able to make sure that we were making the right investments, we were doing the right discovery, and we were thinking holistically about the various needs between learners and leaders and our content and our curriculum and how these organizations would play out. And that was in big contrast to what we'd had before, where it was purely functional leadership. And we had decided to go all in on cross-functional leadership because of some of the benefits and things that we saw there. So now at this point, many of you are like, okay, cool, like that's great to see how you rolled this out. Might be interesting, might not be. But I'm sure many of you are wondering, okay, how did it go? What did you learn? What was super hard? What were some of the things that you thought won, and would you do it again? And so we had a number of challenges. The first of which was over 600 people comprised the experience organization at Pluralsight. And so you can imagine moving out of a functional org design into what I've described. Honestly, it was pretty unfamiliar to a lot of people, the idea that I might be a software engineer reporting into somebody as now my direct leader who may not have a software engineering background, substitute all of the other disciplines, and that's true for everybody. The engineers in particular were skeptical. I know that might be hard for some of you to believe that that could happen, but they were skeptical of how they would be supported by non-engineering leaders. And then, last, it really took time. I'd probably say a solid 4 to 8 months for people to really begin to understand how that principal role was supporting them, how it wasn't a second leader, they were really a coach, and really what did that mean? How did it benefit? How did that work into all of the performance management, everything else? And so these were honestly a lot of the challenges that we'd really had to face. But we had some massive wins that we were just super, super excited about over that time frame. The first is, when you have 40 teams, I don't know of any organization that has 40 teams that are performing perfectly that don't have any challenges. Pluralsight was no exception. And what's interesting is with this new cross-functional org design, we were finally able to figure out the root cause for some of these teams that had been underperforming over a multi-year period. And that's because we had a single leader over the entire team with the responsibility and accountability for all of those functions equally. So when this leader was thinking about the team and their ability to execute, it wasn't a leader focused on just engineering or just design or just product management. They had to look at the composition, the relative strengths and weaknesses, the challenges, the personal context, and diagnose and understand, where is this team winning? Where is this team struggling? Why? What changes do I need to make? How do I help support this team? And this dramatically accelerated Pluralsight's ability to help lift some of these teams that we'd had, struggling a little bit over time. Another huge, huge win that we had is because of the nature of this centralized practices organization, we had just a dramatic improvement to the recruiting and onboarding processes at Pluralsight. These principal product managers, product designers, and software engineers that I mentioned played a huge role in recruiting. We were able to do a much better job of working through, high-volume applicant pipelines, which you experience at a company at Pluralsight stage, being able to really hone in on the types of candidates that we were most excited about, and then help create an entirely elevated onboarding experience for all of these disciplines across the company. And then finally, we had a number of key technology strategy shifts that we were able to enact that honestly were overdue by maybe 18 to 24 months in some instances. And that's because, again, we had a leader who was purely cross-functional in terms of leadership within these organizations, that was accountable to customer business outcomes, that would then have to say, okay, it doesn't matter if it's a product management concern or a product design concern or an engineering concern, what do we need to do in order to achieve this outcome that we envision? And in some cases, we had core technology strategy shifts that we had to enact that were very highly tailored to these specific core value streams. One example is we introduced Kafka and real-time streaming for a lot of the analytics that were occurring at the enterprise layer. And that was a technology strategy change that we had known for a while we should make, but we just really hadn't been able to get our arms wrapped around it until we had these single points of view due to cross-functional leadership. But honestly, the biggest lessons from all of this is if you want to win in product, whether it's a product management focus, a design or engineering focus, ultimately winning is building products that are able to be such that customers are likely to buy them, that when they do in fact buy those products, they make them incredibly happy and they use these products forever. But the challenge is, like, this is a relatively easy to understand recipe, and you can get this right, but you can't do it just one time. You've got to do this forever, even though your customers and your markets are constantly changing. And so the biggest win that we saw in all of this is that when you have teams and leaders that are thinking about what are the right capabilities that need to be present in our product experiences, how do we ensure that we have a healthy user experience, and how is that complemented and strengthened by having a reliable, scalable, and secure code base? So again, this is thinking much more holistically through the lens of what does it take to actually create a sustainable customer outcome that has the characteristics of being something that they want to buy, they love using, and that they'll use it forever. And so how do we actually accomplish that? Like, what did we learn at the individual team level, at the individual practitioner level about how all of this plays out? And I want to talk about tension for a minute. Now, tension a lot of times has maybe a little bit of a negative connotation. It's something where people hear the word and they think it's something that, ideally we don't have tension, or ideally it's something that we can minimize. And I think in a lot of instances, that could be true depending on your frame of reference. But when I'm talking about tension here in my talk today, I'm talking about the kind of tension that occurs on the string of a kite. The kind of tension that without that tension present on that string, you have a completely different experience with the kite than otherwise. I'm talking about the kind of tension that enables suspension bridges to span hundreds and hundreds of feet due to the tension on the cables. And what this means is these product experience teams, because they're composed of individuals that have different backgrounds, different interests, different life contexts, there's a lot of points of disagreement, there's a lot of points of misunderstanding, there's a lot of opportunities for people to not see things the same way. And how I like to think about this is really in terms of advocacy by different roles. So for example, I think of product designers as primarily responsible within a team for advocating for the user. I think of software engineers as being primarily responsible for advocating for the health of a code base. And then on the product management side, it's about advocating for the holistic kind of product and business outcomes that enable this to become sustainable. And I don't know what your experience has been, but I have been both a part of and experienced teams where you may have a product designer that's staying up all night thinking about some overall go-to-market sales or marketing changes that impact maybe the pricing of the product, and they're really concerned about how does this ultimately get packaged up into a broader experience that communicates the value that we're trying to think about. Totally outside of what you may expect or hope. I've also experienced teams where you have a software engineer that is closely collaborating with the designer and really pushing the designer to say, like, I'm not totally convinced that this decision that we're talking about is in the best interest of our customers here. And that give and that pull, that push and that take from these different disciplines is really magical when you experience it, and it's beautiful. And it's my belief that it's at the core of what creates these teams that are able to produce repeatable, reliable outcomes for customers. But there's a big difference between what I'm kind of describing in terms of tension and conflict. The conflict is almost always this kind of impasse that needs to get resolved by an outside party, or otherwise, the conflict, depending on how it does or doesn't get resolved, can, really fester and destroy some of the trust and confidence within teams. And so creating this healthy tension, is ultimately founded on an ability to value each discipline on the team as a co-equal. What that means is there's no reason to say, hey, in this environment, at this moment in time, product design is the most important thing for us, or product management, or software engineering, or any of the related concerns that you might have. And the reason being is, again, if you go back to what I described in terms of how to win over the long term, it's the right capabilities with a healthy UX and ultimately a healthy code base. If you don't have those three things, you don't have a sustainable opportunity for these teams to be able to ultimately deliver value for your customers. And it also is represented by an ability for these individuals on the team to argue against really their own interests. For a product manager or product designer to say, hey, look, yeah, we have all of these things and aspirations that we would love to go engage with, but we actually do have a moment in time in which the code base health that we're experiencing requires some investment. This, tech debt that we may have right now, or some of these technology strategy shifts that we need to go through, like, I actually need to put aside this interest that I may have, or this concern that I may have in lieu of a broader concern that's going to impact us over the long run. And then finally, it's about individuals on the team being able to actively seek the context of everybody else on the team and create shared experiences where people actually understand each other. They actually experience each other as co-equals, as people who are directly invested and engaged in how all of this plays out. And look, I talked earlier on about the org design changes that we made, and I really believe in the structure that we enacted at Pluralsight and what Nate had envisioned. All of the benefits that I described and more, were just tremendous. And if this was an audience full of exclusively leaders that could leave today and go enact org design changes, I could probably spend an hour going deeper on things around the value stream alignment that we did. How did we really coach these individual kind of director level cross-functional leaders into producing better outcomes? But look, at the end of the day, an org design is an org design, even though I'm highly biased based on experience about what we did. But a lot of it comes down to you as individuals on your teams and how you show up. And that's the difference between how well these teams operate versus not in many, many respects. And look, we all sometimes get sucked into getting really myopically focused on what we're committed to and passionate about. Doesn't matter if you're a product manager, a product designer, a software engineer. We all have these times where we really think that we're right, we're the only ones that see the full picture, we're the only ones that can acknowledge the problem that we have in front of us and can do something about it. But to create the tension that I've been talking about requires mutual respect. It requires understanding and appreciation across the roles. Otherwise, you may have a cross-functional team, meaning that you've got a group of people that are supposedly working together that constitute multiple disciplines, but it may not actually be a team that's cross-functional in the sense that the concerns, the goals, the aspirations, the way that they're approaching problems is really this push-pull, give-and-take relationship across these disciplines where you're simultaneously trying to navigate all of the unique problems and viewpoints that are occurring from within the team at the same time. So my invitation, I'm going to go through this for product managers and product designers, but for the next moment, I'll speak to just the product managers. If you're a product manager, based on everything that we learned at Pluralsight, I really encourage you to ask yourself a couple of questions. First, do you see yourself as maybe the only person on the team who sees the whole picture? I come across this a lot with product managers that I interact with. Because the nature of the role, I think this is pretty common. But if you're a product manager and you are sometimes guilty of this, I would really encourage you to reflect on that, because what this means is it's going to be really hard for you to listen to the other members of your team when they have viewpoints and concerns that maybe run counter to what you're experiencing, because it'll be easier for you to say, hey, this engineer is talking about tech debt, or this designer is talking about these affordances that aren't consistent, but they don't understand the pressure that we have to be able to get to market, or the pressure that we have right now to be able to deliver this new experience to create a new upsell opportunity. So really reflect on that. The next question is, are you actively as a product manager and team working to intentionally create environments and practices and behaviors where everyone on the team is experienced as an equal, completely capable of contributing, completely capable of having the insight that really changes the game regardless of their background? And then finally, and maybe most importantly, do you as a product manager view tech debt as a distraction or as an excuse or as something that somebody else should bother with some other time? Because if you do, you're not going to have a sustainable long-term opportunity to create the types of customer experiences that you need in order to win. And then this is kind of related. Finally, when engineers talk to you about the complexity of the work that they're doing, do you ever think hey, these engineers are just totally sandbagging me? They're making this out to be really hard. It's not actually the case. This would be a prompt from my point of view for you to really dig deeper into understanding the context, because if they are sandbagging you, you've messed up something in the relationship that you've got to go fix. And if they're not, then you've got an opportunity to go learn and understand, what's really creating the complexity in their world. And then I'd encourage you to, after you've done that reflection, to actually turn and ask software engineers, what are the technical risks that you're worried about now, 6 months from now, 18 months from now? And ask the product designers, what are the foundational user experience paradigms or affordance patterns that we continue to ignore time and time again? Really step into the context of these disciplines, into their primary concerns that maybe aren't native to you, and lean in and seek that understanding and context. And now switching to the product designers in the room, I'd encourage you to ask yourself, are you able to explain your company's vision and your product strategy to an interested outsider? I don't recommend doing this with a family member. Find somebody that might actually care or be interested in your overall domain and ask yourself, like, could I explain to this person relatively quickly the company vision, the strategy for both the company and the product? And I'd also encourage you to ask yourself, do you understand your team's technology stack and how the decisions within that stack shape the overall experience of your product? And do you see yourself as an equal partner? In my experience leading product design across a couple of organizations, it's common, unfortunately, for many product designers to not really view themselves as a co-equal in the room. And I think a lot of that has to do with the baggage of how product design has not always been valued. But you're never going to create the kind of team dynamic required here if you don't see yourself as co-equal and as an equal partner with the rest of the team. And then as a designer, ask the engineers, how does your front end get compiled and displayed? Which parts of that process are just the worst? And what would need to happen in order to make that better? And I promise you that as a designer, you will understand some of the complexities around why all of those irritating differences and discrepancies between your affordances, your designs, what you envision, why they're happening, and it's not just people being lazy. And you'll find opportunities to really retro and make process improvements or strategy improvements to your team. And then ask the product managers on your team, what is our go-to-market strategy? Where is it winning? Where are we struggling? How does that shape the vision and strategy that we have within our product? And I promise that as you do this, and as you continue as an individual to lean in on some of these things that I've described, you'll be able to see the teams that you operate on operating much more completely from a cross-functional perspective with a lot less conflict and a much, much higher degree of healthy tension, which will enable this team to really operate in a way that's going to build the products that customers are likely to buy, that are going to make them insanely happy when they do, and ultimately keep using those products. And you're going to be able to do it not just once, but do it over and over and over again, even though customers and markets change, because you'll have built the right capabilities on top of a healthy user experience and a healthy code base that's reliable, scalable, and secure. So my invitation to all of you today is to go create healthy tension. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here.
Awesome. Okay. Dave. Wonderful. Taylor wants to know, what other opportunities have you seen in creating co-equality beyond reorgs?
Yeah, Taylor, I love this question. You can create an organizational structure like I described here that puts all of the disciplines on equal footing. I mean, I didn't hit this point explicitly in my talk track, but when you have a product manager, product designer, and engineer reporting into a single leader, which one of those disciplines is more important? The answer is none of them. They're all equal, and the org structure helps that. But you can have that org structure and still have a culture and an environment and a set of practices and behaviors where you still have an implicit, product or design or engineering, holds the final trump card. I've seen that in a lot of organizations. It's typically, engineering or product management kind of has that trump card more often than not. If I had to pick one of the three, frankly, I wish it was the product designers that held the trump card. We'd all be a lot better off for it.
Oh, you're just saying that.
No, I really believe that. I mean, because again, my lived experience as a leader is I'm responsible for an entire set of disciplines and leveraging the unique strengths to go produce outcomes. And my experience says, yeah, give that to the designers all day long. But I haven't answered Taylor's question. So I think ultimately what it comes down to is at the team level, if you feel like there's a lack of equality between the team, that's what team retros are for. That's what open, honest conversations are for. You've got to unpack why. Is there somebody that's really committed on the team to looking good? And the problem with most teams is you have a single product manager, a single product designer, and then multiple engineers. And so if you've got a problem with your product manager, it's probably just a challenge with that person. So you got to really spend the time to go unpack and understand what is creating their life context around why they're showing up. And that's just honest human-to-human work that has nothing to do with an org chart. And I think the foundation of a lot of that lives in the questions that I encourage you to ask before.
Awesome. Sean asks, Creating all of these teams and leaders sounds like the addition of a bunch of middle management. How do you avoid bureaucratic BS?
Yeah, yeah. The key there to avoiding the bureaucratic mess is having structures aligning to value creation. And what I mean by that is when you have an entire organization that has a team, a leader who then reports into, really a senior leader into the executive team, when those teams are all functionally aligned around the same thing that creates value for your customer, like a lot of that gets eliminated. And we actually, I would say, had like a reduction in kind of that middle management-esque nightmare that you would experience, because we didn't have any of those like, hey, a product manager is frustrated with the engineering team, so they've got to go tell the VP of product, who's then got to somehow convince the director of engineering that there's a problem. And the director of engineering, of course, is never going to want to admit or acknowledge that the engineers are the problem. And the same thing is totally true on the other side if it's the engineers frustrated with the product manager. Like, this is nothing about engineers. It's just the nature of having these functional discrepancies. Like, because we eliminated all of that and went cross-functional, like, frankly, the middle management, piece of that was greatly reduced, and we were aligned around some of those core areas of value for the company.
Awesome. Dennis asks, how do you suggest we can help make changes while we don't have a seat at the table? We're not the person in a position to decide to make those changes. Yeah,
I've got two answers for you. The pragmatic answer is, like, depending on the organizational characteristics you find yourself in, there's going to be a ceiling. Like, I don't want to give you kind of this rosy picture of here's the 3-step recipe and you follow it and it's going to magically solve the challenge in any organization. Like, that's just not true. Some of you, unfortunately, work in environments and teams and companies that maybe just don't have some of the right cultural elements or that at least don't align to what I'm describing here today. So if that's the case, like, I think you just have to ask yourself, like, what is the belief you have in your product and in the future, and what are you aligned to? So taking off like the pragmatic point of view and just acknowledging that, I think practically what I would encourage you to do is to start with trying to understand the context behind why your organization currently does certain things. Somebody enacted some type of a structure or a process or a philosophy for a reason, and if you can understand really what drove and motivated those, and then if you can understand what their vision is for the future, oftentimes I think you'll find a storyline that connects the old to the new vision with some changes that you're contemplating or recommending as a major, building block into stepping forward. And I would really encourage you to think about how to lean in on those capabilities and kind of bridging those gaps as opposed to just coming in with like a, hey, here's a bunch of changes that we can make. My experience is it's pretty tough when you don't have that proverbial seat at the table to get that enacted. You've got to do some kind of managing up and understanding what they really care about and why, and then go through some of those changes.
Is there one disadvantage that you could maybe say that there is to this model? Oh, geez, yeah.
If I'm going to just be brutally honest with everybody, being a cross-functional leader is way harder. If you have to wake up every day and think about the concerns of multiple disciplines, especially if you've never been an engineer or a designer or a product manager, whatever your background's been, like learning curve is super steep. You get a lot of things wrong. You don't know the right questions to be asking. You don't have the right telemetry. It's really challenging, and that's where the model that I've described, like, geez, don't even think about it if you don't have strong functional excellence within each of the disciplines that we've been talking about today. Like, if that's not there, like, this thing's gonna just be super hard. It's gonna probably, cause way more problems than it's worth. Think about this as like, how do I raise the roof and lift the ceiling of the type of, outcomes our team's able to produce.
Awesome. That's all the questions, and let's give Dave another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.